For our chemical fate and transport research in comparison to engineering practices, we focused on agricultural runoff and its effects on the environment. So just an introduction to our project. Rural agricultural non-point source pollution can be extremely dangerous to surface waters. This pollution can come in the form of manures, pesticides, fertilizer, organic matter, and soils. And each of these compounds has unique pollutants that influence and travel through the environment in different ways. So it's really important that each be studied in its own right so that we can better characterize how these pollutants move in the environment. So we picked 3 studies that related to rural agricultural non-point source pollution.
So our first study took place in Ghana, Africa. It's entitled "The Impact of Agricultural Runoff on the Quality of 2 Streams in Vegetable Farm Areas in Ghana." These are the authors. I'm not going to read them to you, but this article was found in the Journal of Environmental Quality. So these vegetable farms in Ghana have a really high precipitation rate, so that causes a lot of runoff, which is why it was really interesting to study. And a lot of the chemicals found in the runoff are organophosphates. So this study focused on 2 different rivers in Ghana surrounded by vegetable farms to see the effects on the water quality of the runoff from the farms. So these are the 2 rivers, the Akumadan and the Tono.
Okay, so the second study that we looked at was completed in Vermont in the United States. It was entitled "The Effects of Agricultural Runoff on Vegetation Composition of a Priority Conservation Wetland, Vermont, USA." These were the 2 authors, and it was a study that was administered by the School of Natural Resources at the University of Vermont, and it was published in the Journal of Environmental Quality also. The study focused on the Franklin Bog, which is a conservation wetland in Vermont, near Franklin, Vermont. It's a conservation area, and it's also near a developing part of Vermont. And so they wanted to look at how ag runoff is impacting the water quality there. And it's also a native waterway, so they also wanted to see how ag runoff is affecting existing waterways in the region. So this is the Franklin Bog, and as you can see, there's quite a few waterways that are running into and out of it. And then you can also see that there's water coming from the Franklin Bog into Lake Carmi, which is a larger body of water.
And the third paper was a study done in Zimbabwe in Africa. And the paper was titled "An Investigation of the Impacts of Agricultural Runoff on the Water Quality and Aquatic Organisms in a Low Sand River System in Southeast Zimbabwe." And it was done in 2007 for the National University of Science and Technology, and it was published in the Water Resource Management. Like the other papers, it was focused on agricultural fields, but this paper really wanted to focus on the effects of the benthic fauna. And what benthic fauna are is basically any organism that lives in the stream, like not plants or fungus, but we're talking about like bacteria, like invertebrates and fish. And the researchers wanted to focus on the effects of pollutants during different seasons. Zimbabwe is known for its semi-arid climate with a rainy season and a dry season. So it has a very high dissolved oxygen variability, also with temperature changes, because during the winter the metabolism of the organisms degrading organic matter is much slower. So that's going to be a factor. And then there's also droughts, which means there's less water in the environment for the same amount of pollutants, so the concentration is going to be much higher. And there's also going to be a rainy season, so there's going to be heavy rainfall, which will dilute the nutrients by a huge factor. And then all these pollutants are due to human impacts, so we're talking about agricultural fields and sewage and stuff like that. So the hypotheses for these papers are agricultural runoff and sewage discharge, control the variability of nutrient concentrations.
All right, so now we're going to talk about methods and results of all of the different studies. So in Ghana, Africa, like I said, we studied the two rivers. The Akamadan has significantly more rainy days per year than the Tono, actually over 2 times more, 150 versus 70. It's also subject to more pesticides. It has a different, it's surrounded by different types of vegetable farms, mostly tomatoes, some eggplant, pepper, and okra, and also subject to more endosulfan than chlorpyrifos, which is what the other river was subject to. And endosulfan is actually a pesticide that's trying to be phased out. So guessing since it's in Africa, they're still using it because it's probably cheap. And then the Tono is surrounded by vegetable farms, mostly dealing with rice, onions, millet, maize, groundnuts, sorghum, and tomatoes. So the sample sites that they looked at in the two rivers, there was an upstream site and a downstream site. The upstream site was surrounded by abandoned farm fields, so they weren't active, there weren't pesticides going through them, and the downstream site was surrounded by active farm fields, so there was a lot of pesticides running into the stream at the downstream sites. And the sample times varied per river. The Akamadan was sampled in March and April, and the Tono sampled in March and May. So, the results of this study showed that in the dry season there was no pesticide contamination, and this was true for both upstream and downstream of both rivers. And then in the wet season, the upstream sites both had very low concentrations of pesticides since they were inactive farm sites, so pesticides that were getting into the water from that site were probably just leftovers from whatever had been farmed. And then downstream was where all of the pesticide concentrations showed up. The Akamadan had 0.2 micrograms per liter of the first pesticide, and then 0.07 of the endosulfan, and then the Tono also had more endosulfan, but less so than the Akamadan.
Okay, so for the methods for the study that was completed at Franklin Bog in Vermont, as for the sampling sites, Franklin Bog was chosen because it is in the Lake Champlain watershed, and it's like a pretty influential part of that watershed, so that's why they wanted to characterize the effects of runoff there. The bog itself has 3 major like ecological sectors: an open mat, a peripheral forested wetland, and an emergent marsh. And so that kind of leads in the open mats in the center of the wetland, and then the peripheral forested wetlands on the outside, as is the emergent marsh. The study sites, they had a set of parameters that they chose in order to pick the different sites. So the sites needed to be at the perimeter of the wetland. They had to be the base of inflowing water sources, which makes sense because they were determining the effects of runoff coming into the wetland. So obviously there had to be some source of water at the sampling sites. And then they also wanted the dominant community that was present at the site to be the peripheral forested wetland, as I talked about above. So they ended up having 6 sites in total. 1 through 4 were fed by forested streams, and those were considered the reference sites. And then sites 5 and 6 were fed from agricultural streams, and those were considered the experimental sampling sites. So in this map you can see the reference sites 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the 2 sites where the agricultural runoff would be coming in are sites 5 and 6 towards the right. So they did 2 types of sampling. They did water sampling and analysis, and then they also did soil and vegetation sampling and analysis. So for the water sampling, they took grab samples from each of the 6 sites at 3 separate rain events in the spring and summer of 1998, which makes sense that they would want to sample at rain events because that's when the runoff would be the highest. And then from these water samples, they took them back to the lab and analyzed them for total phosphorus, ammonium, and nitrate, which are 3 of the compounds that are most commonly found in fertilizers. As for the vegetation analysis, they established transects at each of the sites, so kind of like these 4x2 plots that were 25 meters apart, and they went 25 meters apart until they either reached the center of the bog, which is where the open mat was, or until they had created 6 intersect plots. And then in each of these intersects, they determined the percent coverage of the vegetation visually. And then they also took vegetative soil analysis samples that were taken, and they picked the sites. They picked the intersects to take those samples at via a random number generator, so that way they didn't have to sample every single intersect, but it was an unbiased sampling method. And then from those soil samples that they took, they also analyzed those for phosphorus, ammonium, and nitrate. As for the results, the nitrates and phosphorus were present in all 6 of the sites, so the 4 reference sites and the 2 experimental sites in both the soil and the water, but they mostly talked about the water results. So for nitrate, they found that nitrate in the the sites that were influenced by the agricultural runoff, so sites 5 and 6, had an overwhelming amount more of nitrate than the reference sites. So as you can see here, from 0.62 milligrams per liter to 1.35 milligrams per liter, where at the reference site they only had less than 0.37 milligrams per liter of nitrates. And then as for the phosphorus, in the agricultural runoff sites, it was also overwhelmingly greater than in the reference sites. So as you can see, from 0.07 to 0.37, whereas in the reference sites, they were seeing less than 0.09 on average milligrams per liter of phosphorus. And then in addition to the water quality results, they talked about the vegetation characteristics that they saw. So there was a higher total percent of vegetative cover in the sites that were agriculturally impacted, which suggests that these sites were seeing more nutrients, which was promoting the growth of the vegetation. And then they also saw a decrease in biodiversity at the agricultural runoff impacted sites. So at these sites, in the 4 reference sites, they saw up to 9 native wetland species, whereas in the agricultural runoff impacted sites, they saw, for the most part, 1 or 2 out of 9 of these species, which suggests that non-native or very competitive native plants were kicking out the other species and colonizing at those intersects. So, which suggests that these were the plants that were able to take the nutrients and turn over the quickest.
So for the Zimbabwe study, there was a river near a agricultural field, and the river was divided into 2 zones according to land use. And what that means is, like, they would look at the land and see if it was dealing with pre-treated sewage discharge, if it was along a national park, which it was at one point. There's like a significant amount of drainage from an agricultural field, and then there's also a water supply canal that feeds in and out of the river. So for the methods, they collected the benthic samples for like the worms and the larvae. They identified them to the family and genus level, and then this was done at different points of the year to see how it changed with seasons. And then for the water quality, again, they collected during different seasons, and they observed the pH, temperature, dissolved oxygen, light penetration, conductivity. They also ran the samples through a variety of tests for the different nutrients and pollutants. They also took sediment samples and ran them for total phosphate, ammonium nitrate, and total nitrogen. To test for inorganics, they ran them through atomic absorption spectrophotometry, and for potassium and sodium, they subjected them to flame photometry. They did a statistical analysis on the results, and they found that there was significant differences in and below the effluent outfall for calcium, potassium, sodium, and total nitrogen and phosphates. And that does, and in the paper, they found that the river that they sampled was not polluted by the agricultural fields. That somehow the pollutants were being transported away from the catchment zone, because in the sediment analysis they should have found the levels of sediment from the influent and then to like a deeper part where everything settles out. They did not find expected results. So they said that the significant differences are influenced by other environmental factors. And it's also known that agricultural fields have been identified as the biggest contributor for river water pollution. And this can lead to eutrophication, which can result in the death of many or all life in a stream. However, the study shows that moderate eutrophication is ideal for aquatic life, and they found that there was not a significant amount of pollution, but a moderate amount of eutrophication. And what that means is the nutrients go in, the algae like the nutrients, so the algae grows on the rocks and in the benthic layer. So there's the invertebrates that like to feed on the algae that's growing, and then the fish in the stream feed on the invertebrates, and then there's piscivores that feed on the fish. And that's a bottom-up effect where just the effect of just a little bit more nutrients can cause everything to increase from the bottom of the food chain, the algae, all the way up to the top predators of that area. But then there's like a tipping point where the trade-off favors fish kill and not really the positive effects, but you start to see a lot of the negative effects.
Okay, so how does this all relate to environmental engineering? The definition of environmental engineering is the application of engineering principles to improve and maintain the environment for the protection of human health and at-risk ecosystems. So basically to better understand how industrial and agricultural, which we focused on, practices influence the environment and the humans and animals in it. And we do this so that we can minimize or extinguish any detrimental practices or effects to the environment.
So these studies obviously all relate in the fact that they're centered around agricultural runoff and the impacts on the environment. But additionally, we obviously saw some similarities between the experimental methods such as chemical analysis and sampling, the field work that was done, as well as the lab work. And then in addition, in each of the 3 articles, there was a certain level of understanding that was necessary between ecology and engineering that helped to make the authors successful in their study. So obviously, like an understanding of the way that the environment works as a whole, and then also kind of with engineering a way that how humans can impact the environment. And then all of the work in the studies was aimed towards finding that final goal of gaining a better understanding of the situation. So in this case, gaining a better understanding of how agricultural runoff is impacting our natural world in order to take action so that, as Lydia said, we can take action to remedy the situation, or as engineers, construct ways in which we can alter it completely. Okay, so in conclusion, runoff, as we said many times, can be very detrimental to the environment, but in some cases is beneficial in small amounts. So obviously, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are commonly present as the basis of most agricultural runoff, those are things that plants and animals and humans, we all need to survive. So obviously, introducing small amounts of these elements into the environment can be beneficial in that plants are being able to grow and colonize. But obviously in large, in the cases of extreme runoff, it is not a good thing. As Jay mentioned before, there's eutrophication, which is very detrimental to particularly to aquatic environments. So as just in a conclusion to Lydia's article, there's heavy precipitation at vegetable farms, which produces more runoff which causes toxins to enter the water, which can kill aquatic organisms. And then relating back to Jay's article and my article about streams and bogs, agricultural runoff increases nitrate and total phosphorus that's present in these streams, which can increase the total percentage of vegetative coverage, which isn't necessarily a good thing because most of those plants are from one species, so overall the biodiversity is decreased, as well as the amount of native species there, so that agricultural runoff opens the door for non-native species and invasive species, which can really cause a problem for ecosystems in the long run. And then with Jay's article, moderate eutrophication prior to oxygen depletion has a bottom-up effect on ecosystems where those producers are really controlling the environment. And it can also, that moderate eutrophication can cause increased biodiversity and stream health, but the emphasis is on moderate and not like the extreme eutrophication that a certain runoff can cause. And here's our works cited. Any questions?